Welcome, my friends, to this webinar organized by Leadership Focus International, or simply Focus in short. Today, we are discussing a very important and divisive theme, unfortunately, which our team has named Overcoming Conspiracy Virus. Before I introduce the theme, let me introduce a wonderful team of panelists calling at this time from 4 countries, namely Romania, UK, Slovenia, and the US. So I would like to welcome Liviu Bocaniala from Romania. Liviu Bocaniala is a seasoned music artist and the president of Polylogos Association, of which he's also a co-founder together with his wife, Camila. Polylogos Association is a politically independent leadership development non-profit organization providing resources, training, advocacy, and a space for trust and the community building among thinkers and doers and creators and current and aspiring leaders in Romania. Then I would like to welcome Jill Hall from Ohio. Jill Hall is a candidate for City Council at large in Kettering, Ohio, and the adjunct professor at United Theological Seminary in Ohio. Jill received her PhD in Intercultural Studies at the Osbury Theological Seminary and has worked for many years at the intersection of academia and public policy. Then I would like to welcome Arnold Porter from Florida. Arnold Porter is a pastor and a clinical chaplain who works for one of Florida's largest hospital groups. He has cared for numerous families affected by the COVID-19 virus. Reverend Porter is actively involved in community organizations such as the United Way of Central Florida and the Orange County School Board's Additions Volunteer Program. And then let me welcome Camila Bocaniala from Romania or Norway. Camila Bocaniala is a social activist, artist, and the program director of Polylogos Association, of which she is also co-founder with her husband, Liviu Bocaniala, whom I introduced a moment ago together with their organization. And then let me introduce Tihomir Odorčić from Slovenia. Dr. Tihomir Odorčić is a family medicine doctor from Kočevje, where he and his wife Lydia run their clinic. During this pandemic, he is also active in the local municipality COVID clinic and emergency unit. He is also involved in public and radio education through lectures, workshops, seminars, and counseling across Slovenia and Croatia. And then I would like to invite and welcome Heather Staff from UK. Heather Staff is a political advisor on refugee and migration policy to UK parliamentarians, and a prolific writer and international speaker and mentor. In the recent years, Heather has been always a welcome speaker in Croatia, Serbia, Romania, Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, and other countries. And then I would like to welcome Zdravko Plantak, who is the professor of religion and ethics at Loma Linda University in California. He studied at King's College in London with a PhD in ethics and theology. He published a monograph, The Silent Church. Dr. Zdravko Plantak served as a church pastor, chair of School of Religion, director of graduate studies in bioethics, and serves also as director of MARS program, which stands for Masters of Arts in Religion and Society at Loma Linda. And now, just a few words about our program today. Together with the spreading of the COVID pandemics, flourishes and spreads like wildfire a dangerous conspiracy virus or conspiracy pandemics. Since 2016 and the birth of QAnon conspiracies only a short time later, the conspiracy virus has metastasized into many forms. Some of the fatal consequences of those we witnessed on January the 6th. We are still trying to recover from the effects of wild lies that inspired the crowd to storm the Capitol. Also, we are hearing about the increased number of violent acts public expressions of anger, even murders committed by people deeply taken by conspiracy lies. Tragically, there is an increase in numbers of the government leaders who are steeped into the conspiracy's falsehood too. Today, we would like to focus on the consequences and damage done by the conspiracy narratives that spread lies around COVID-19 and about the measures that are proven to work successfully against spreading of the pandemics, such as the need for people to be vaccinated. We would like to talk about the consequences for people's lives in general, but also for the faith communities and the consequences of political character. Is there something we can offer to try to change the course of this crisis? We are aware, friends, that we are only touching the surface, but I believe that our team, covering diverse angles of the problem, will be able to challenge us today in a good way. So I would like to begin this conversation by asking Liviu Bocaniala a question. Liviu, we are living in surreal times, human lives at stake, and yet too many are laboring to spread lethal misinformation and false narratives. How did we get here?
Thank you, Tihomir. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'll just jump in, remembering that almost 2 years ago, not long after the pandemic started, and we all were thinking that there are going to be just a few more months before we get back to normal. I was writing an article, not for a specific publication, but merely in a redemptive way, finding myself human again, elevated on the brink of a song. I was breathing as part of the one universal breath that at that time was wandering around the globe manifold ways. We were all together suffering, all together crying, all together helping each other, all together celebrating any small or big victory. I was all of a sudden proud to be a villager in this large universal village, leaving my cynicism aside and embracing the corny but healthy feeling of camaraderie. So at that time, I was writing the following. I realized how much I miss the simple, raw expressions of humanity these days. I realized that there is no amazing grace bestowed on stone or metal, only on people. Yet I'm sad because something inside me tells me that when all of this emptiness, and I was at that time referring to the intense, deadly initial attack of the virus. So when all this emptiness exhausts itself, we might be going back to being the same aging ignoramuses. In other words, plainly stupid people who got ourselves here in the first time and in the first place. I had no clue at that time, unfortunately none of us did, that this will prove to be way too real, that once the first wave of the pandemic will start fading away, the planet will indeed fall under a brutal attack of stupidity and ignorance, beginning with all that American tragicomedy and continuing with the vaccine saga. And here we are, way into the fourth wave of the same pandemic, giving the word polarization ever new meanings and seeming to relieve in a demented spiral the end of the story of the Babel Tower. As if we needed more reasons to judge each other, our personal law and order condemning vocabulary has been enriched with yet another verdict. Are you vaccinated? And all its corollaries. I'm asking you, how in the world did we get here? As story goes, Benjamin Franklin was walking out of Independence Hall after the Constitutional Convention in 1787 when someone shouted out, "Doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" Which Franklin supposedly responded at once, both witty and ominous. "A republic, if you can keep it." I would dare to paraphrase and say that in pivotal moments like this, when each of us have been entrusted with care over a religion or a country or a city or one community or one family, we will have those if we can keep it. It is easy to dichotomize us and them according to one's assumptions, baggage, choices, or rejections. What is not easy is to elevate oneself above all these and see a wider perspective. But exactly this uneasiness will make me one's keeper's brother, also in the sense quoted above. Yesterday, I read the bragging of a photographer saying that all summer long he attended many weddings and spent time in enclosed spaces with about 3,000 strangers who did not wear or assume any protection against COVID-19. He also added that he even shared a bed with someone who had COVID-19, but he didn't get it, in spite of not getting any vaccine or protecting himself in any way. He said he will go to the market to buy some fruit and vegetables and mix it with garlic and make himself a nice smoothie that will keep this flu, please notice my quotations mark, and any other viruses at bay. This guy, the photographer, was writing all this as an answer to a friend of mine who was announcing that she got her third booster dose of vaccine. And he finished his rant saying a big "bless you all." Now, while I was preparing for this webinar, even now as we are in this webinar, my mother has not been feeling very well. We actually had to call the ambulance. She's been having COVID-19 for about a week. And after the initial mild symptoms, she fell in bed quite ill, feeling very, very nauseous and having diarrhea. Over the past 3 years, my mom had 3 rather complicated surgeries. Her digestive system is very sensitive at the best of days. She developed a long and complicated list of allergies, some of them to most common medication for nausea and diarrhea, and also some antibiotics. She cannot even have a smoothie or even too much garlic before it reacts with her. And she's one of the rare but real cases who cannot take a vaccine. And yet she got the virus in spite of us around her and herself being extremely cautious. Can anyone explain this rather ironic situation to me? What would you have done? Would it have worked replying to that photographer and tell him he's an, please excuse my colloquialism, irresponsible sad ass who should be very quiet and get in line for the job? Or maybe I should just call my mom and reassure her about her great immune system and that she'll be fine, while also recommended she makes herself a smoothie. How did we get here, dear people? But maybe it doesn't even matter how we got here. Maybe what matters most is how we get out of here. Maybe it matters most to remember the golden rule proclaimed by Jesus of Nazareth during his Sermon on the Mount and described by him as the second greatest commandment. the common English phrase, I think it is, do unto others what you would have them do unto you. Maybe if we have nothing to say that does not sound smart and insensible, we should just stop and say nothing. Look around for some sand and start scribbling in it. If you are a follower of Jesus of Nazareth, maybe it is time more than ever before to remember what it means to be a real disciple of him. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, well, maybe you should become one to begin with. But if you don't want to become one, maybe you should just look up the word common sense in a dictionary. I'm quoting here what the Oxford Dictionary says. Common sense means good sense and sound judgment in practical matters. And after we have looked it up, maybe we should start living according to that. Thank you, Tihomir. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Livio. As I've been listening to you, I'm being reminded about a number of stories that are coming from your country, that are coming from the whole region, from Serbia. And all of them are sharing the same thing. And this is that we are living in the time of severe crisis. Only a friend of mine today, and who came from America to Serbia for a holiday, got COVID there. He had to wait in line today to see a doctor since 5 o'clock up to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and he gave up. This only demonstrates how serious the situation is. And yet at the same time, there are choruses of those who are denying all of this or undermining the level of severity of the situation. And many are using the argument of freedom and the choice, that basically whether I put the masks on or whether I'm getting vaccinated, that's none's business but my own. Jill, I would have a question for you that kind of links from what Livio was sharing and to what I believe you want to share with us. We hear from many sides complaints that our freedoms are being attacked, that no one should force us to wear masks or get vaccinated, that a few powerful people and sinister people in the world want to kill us. Even certain political leaders are trying to score politically by encouraging their loyalists to resist any measures needed to get us through the pandemics. There is this question that comes out of this, and this is freedom on one side and the balance that leads us to responsibility. How do we balance freedom and responsibility?
Thanks, T. Homer. It's good to be here with my friends to do another webinar and to see so many familiar faces. And this is such an important topic and such an example of the really strange times we're living in. This conversation in the United States where Christians or cultural Christians understand the balance between liberty and responsibility seems to have a major disconnect. In the Declaration of Independence in the United States, it says all men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's often quoted here, but it seems that liberty is misunderstood these days when used in the same sentence as not getting vaccinated, because one's liberty doesn't include taking away another's liberty. Endangering the lives or impairing others' ability to pursue happiness due to causing them impairment, death, or verifiable long-term impacts of COVID is not liberty. And there's an extremist political focus on religious liberty that doesn't make any connection to anything actually scriptural in the Christian context. And our liberties have limits when they stomp on the rights of others. It's not selfishness. It comes with responsibility that's inherent to the social contract and the idea that the Republic was founded on. The social contract is a voluntary response in democracy and how democracy is built. So I want to be clear that I'm talking about following the data on the voluntary choice to be vaccinated in order to get through this pandemic. I'm not suggesting mandatory vaccinations. And it seems like from a Christian standpoint that this should be clear. The Bible says, be careful not that your freedom doesn't cause another to stumble in 1 Corinthians 8:9. There's so many scriptures that are relevant, clearly relevant to loving your neighbor, that we wouldn't even have time to go through all of them. But there's some interesting points I wanted to note. For example, the first recorded quarantine and social distancing was actually biblical in Leviticus. We're also seeing something very different than the first church in the 2nd and 3rd century than we do in the US church today. Rodney Stark writes about in The Rise of Christianity how one of the things that actually made Christianity grow was the early church's response to a plague that was going on during that time. And that we were the first to go in and being willing to show care and love to people who were sick. And because we built social networks and showed community through that, that was one of the very things that caused Christianity to grow. And when other people's families and social networks abandoned them, the early church was the first to go into the plague to care for others. Also, Martin Luther wrote, there was a plague during the time of the Reformation. He said, and I think this is really interesting, therefore I should ask God mercifully to protect us. I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine, and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed in order to not become contaminated and thus perchance infect and pollute others, and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. See, this is such a God-fearing faith because it's neither brash nor foolhardy and does not tempt God. So that's what he wrote in a letter to somebody else as a Christian response to a plague. Part of the job of the state is public health. It's to protect life and health. In contrast, what does the anti-vaccine Christian seek? Is really the liberty to risk the lives of others. Christianity in this case means I want to do what I want to do. And there is a valid concern about the protection of religious liberty in some cases, but its overuse has allowed for what a writer, David French, called a sense of religious entitlement that is way more emphasized than Christian responsibility nowadays. If we pursue a religious liberty that stomps on others, Christians are at risk of doing the very thing that they fear, which is diminishing their rights to religious liberty in the eyes of the culture. Things as simple as wearing a mask or getting a vaccine seem like a fundamental way to love others, a fundamental way to love our neighbor. Yet some white evangelicals are part of spreading a plague instead of being the ones to prevent it, which is just a stark picture of some of the insanity of our times. And unfortunately, continuing to wear away evangelicals' moral status. However, presenting reasonable and fact-based arguments doesn't seem to change people's minds. I think the only thing that is going to change people's minds from vaccine conspiracy theorists is a heart change. It seems that there are many who are extremists who use the words religious liberty in the United States, have a broken moral compass and hardened hearts that are difficult to penetrate with arguments based on rationalism or love of neighbor. And the only comparable mass delusion that I've actually seen that compares to this is the Stop the Steal movement that happened on January 6th. Christians are increasingly pandered to by populist politicians with a fear-based message. And unfortunately, Christians in America are full of fear. So both of these examples have to do with fear of being controlled and at the mercy of people who they think want to destroy them, which has allowed people in the church to fall prey to lies, like the follower of the Pharisees in Jesus' time. However, I do want to acknowledge that the establishment has had some hand in fostering this fear as well. We have an unbelievable healthcare crisis in the United States, and politicians could fix this system and they haven't. Pharmaceutical companies are allowed to price gouge people. People are scared of pharmaceutical companies. I hear just tragic stories about the lack of healthcare all the time, and there's social problem after social problem that can be pointed to as based on some of our healthcare issues in the United States. So I too have been vulnerable to wanting to buy the latest health supplement that's going to change my life. And in this way, people tend to believe alternative health practitioners who foster this fear of establishment medicine, and that doesn't help either. So I think that I want to say that the overwhelming data obviously supports vaccines, and that in this case, we really have to think about what is going to end this plague and what does the data show. We live in a pluralistic society, and because of that, neither the left or the right can tell each other exactly how to think. And as I said, we can't tell people they have to get the shot. We can't mandate it legally. But both sides need to demonstrate a willingness to respect the liberty of the other without stomping on their life, to right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's all I have to say, and I look forward to hearing from everybody else.
Thank you, Jill. I like your thoughts that we can't tell people what they have to do, whether to be vaccinated or not. But also at the same time, this question of freedom is connected with accountability and responsibility. And while we cannot force anyone to do it, at the same time, I think we have every reason to help people see the link that my freedom is not my freedom alone, but it does have consequences, and it does come in a relationship with the community and with the others. So the way I act doesn't affect only me, but also the others. In Liviu's case and his mother, who is a vulnerable person, her family took care that she is protected from COVID. But somewhere, somehow, this virus came to her because someone else was careless and too much protective of his or her freedom. And this leads me now to my question to Arnold, because here, Arnold is a person who sees what is going on. He doesn't just read it from the newspapers. He's there with the people who are sick and dying from this virus. And I would like to ask you a question. I would say, you're ministering to those who are struggling and dying from COVID at this time. What lessons can we learn from your experience of service as a chaplain to those suffering and dying? What does it look actually like to fight for the lives of the infected people in the overloaded hospitals? Please welcome Arnold.
Thank you for having me to be a part of this session. There's so many places that I can begin, but I can truly tell you that not only does COVID affect those who are sick, but it extends to their families also. COVID, this new strand has become what we call a family affair. We are finding multiple family members are affected by COVID in one household. We're finding that there are parents who are homeschooling their children, but one parent is working, they come home and they share the virus with the family members. One usually ends up sick and 9 out of 10 times dying because it was transmitted from one family member. And the common denominator is no one has been vaccinated. Now, and in saying that no one has been vaccinated, it brings about suffering for the entire family. As a clinical chaplain, those that work with me, we find it difficult to see families suffering when there really should be no suffering. In conversation with a lot of the family members, one family member believes that we don't need to be vaccinated, while another family member wants to get vaccinated. And then at the same time, it's too late by the time the family makes up its mind that we're going to get vaccinated, because COVID has affected the whole family. And again, one person finds themselves in the hospital in critical care and eventually dying. I took some notes to myself and found out, as I say, families are being affected by this. Not only that, a lot of people don't understand that COVID is a death sentence to a lot of people with comorbidities, those who have other illnesses that they're dealing with. It has, you come in one way and you leave out another way. You don't leave out the way you came in, let me say it like that. And then there's always long-term effects. For me as a chaplain and the team that I work with as a chaplain, we do our best to minister to families in the beginning of COVID. We provide assurances, but we don't provide guarantees. The assurances are that we will be there to support your family through the entire process that the family goes through. There are some success cases, and there are a lot of unsuccessful cases. When families have family conferences, we sit down and we listen to the family's concerns about their loved one's care. And then we share the unfortunate news that their loved one will never recover from this and will eventually pass. My role as a chaplain is to listen, to provide some insight, to provide resources for these family members that will eventually lose a family member. And COVID, death comes quick in a lot of cases. One moment you can be in bed and we think that you are improving. Within an hour, you can be in cardiac arrest and pass. That's how COVID reacts. It doesn't let us know when you're going to die a lot of times. There is a process that we see. And so family members, a lot of times they come in here with hopes, hopes that their family member will leave the hospital in the way they have come in, but that is not the case when it comes to COVID. This is not the flu, as we tell them. This is completely different from the flu. We have a lot of cultural challenges when it comes to COVID because of misinformation, what they listen to, what they've been told. As our first speaker spoke about the photographer, we have the same thing going on in Florida. We have misinformation, people refusing to wear their mask, people refusing to be respectful of others' space. All those things are challenging to us. And then when their loved one gets sick, they come to the hospital with an expectation for us to heal them. And by the time they come to the hospital, it's impossible to heal them because there's so much damage that has been done. And so it's my responsibility to bridge the gap between life and death when it comes to families, to help them to understand that we're moving from a life situation and we're moving toward death because their family member has waited so long to come to the hospital. And at the same time, because again, it's a family thing now. No one in the family has been vaccinated, so everyone gets COVID, and it always affects one person. One of the things I when it comes to misinformation, I was looking for some scripture, and the scripture came to me, Hosea 4:6, that said, "My people perish because of a lack of knowledge," and because we reject knowledge. Conversation with a young man on Sunday who told me he didn't believe in taking the shot because he says Jesus didn't say take the shot. Okay, I agree with him. Jesus didn't tell him to take the shot. But the Bible tells us to be wise as a serpent and as humble as a dove. And then I pointed out to him also that if he believes that God is the creator of everything, which he agreed upon me. So we went through this process of God created everything. God created man, he created woman, he created scientists. So you tell me God can't create the mind of a scientist to come up with something to help us in the midst of this situation. He went silent on me. He got up and walked out of the church. I was trying to show him that some things that you're hearing from others lead to death. and you're perishing because of a lack of knowledge. God has given us the knowledge and what we need to make it through. But yet again, we find ourselves listening to those who don't have good intentions, all the conspiracy theories. And I have resolved myself as I help patients, families through COVID, that when it comes to debating whether COVID is real or COVID is not real, I choose not to debate. I live it every day. I take the depths home with me every day. I sleep with them every day. All those things affect me, and they affect the team that I work with on a daily basis, because of people are refusing to be informed in a positive way when it comes to COVID. I like what our first speaker said, and I wrote it down. It said, "It's not how we got here. It's not how we got here, but how do we get out?" And that's one of the questions that we always pose to ourselves. How do we get past this? Well, we're dealing with in Florida. We're dealing with a lot of culture. We have various cultural groups. A lot of they bring their family members in, short of breath, and they find out something different. The expectation is that they will get well or God will heal them. And that's not the case based upon culture. And then we have language barriers in Florida, where there's some that don't understand, no matter whether you have someone interpret for them. There's still a communication block. There's still an expectation that their loved one will be healed. So we have various challenges in Florida when it comes to dealing with families and dealing with COVID. But one of the highlights that we take solace in doing at the hospital where I work at, we allow family members an opportunity to be with their loved ones before their pass, in many cases, when we know that they're going to pass. One of the chaplains introduced to us the hand of God, which is 2 simple gloves with warm water that we place our patient's hand in, which shows warmth and compassion. It's like the hand of God is what we call it. And then we're in there with them. We don't allow them to pass alone. Someone is always there with them. When it comes to families who are present, we make it as pleasant as possible, even though it's not pleasant for a loved one to die, but we're there to provide support for them. And so if I can say anything to any of us today, it would be that we must do our best to continue to educate people, and we must take politics out of COVID and think of people. Government must move from what's best for the party and decide on what's best for the people. That's the challenge that we have in the state of Florida. It's a challenge we have in the United States. Everyone's taking sides rather than doing the right thing. And it's killing people. I'll just say it like that. It's killing people. Again, my people perish because of a lack of knowledge. That's what the Bible says, because we have rejected knowledge. And so I'd say we must do our best to educate and move from the misinformation and tell people the truth and allow people to choose. I agree, people should have a choice, but at the same time, if you're impeding upon my safety, if you're impeding upon my liberty also, I think some choices need to be made. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnold. I personally find it very powerful, the way you have come to us today. And you have truly brought it to us in a real sense, what it looks like for those who are dying and their families, and how real this situation is. And yet, in the midst of this situation, we often struggle with the question, what are the churches and faith communities doing to help the way you are helping, and to help people understand how severe the situation is, that we need to take the steps that are responsible. So Camilla, I'm coming to you now. The responses of the church organizations and communities to the current crisis very much differ. Some are giving a clear message of call to accountability and sound judgment. Some actually, unfortunately, too many are part of a problem, while the others are kind of in the middle, unclear, compromising, and giving a confusing call to action. Just within the last few days, Camilla, I had an opportunity to listen to 3 sermons. To be honest, some of them I didn't endure to hear up to the end. But I'm bringing them here because one of them was so militant, actually the one that really brings people onto the streets to be violent in the name of freedom, because apparently democracy is going away. The other sermon that I was listening was full of eschatological confusion. And then the last that I listened was, obviously the preacher had an intention to help people understand how serious the situation was, but it was so wishy-washy that at the end of the day, probably both groups of people just believe that they're right. Those who do not want to take this crisis seriously and those who do want. So my question to you is, what role should the church organization and faith leaders play at this time of pandemics and this great divisiveness that is greatly damaging many faith communities and relationships? Camilla, please.
Well, Tiomir, I think I have more questions than answers to this question, but you encouraged me to speak from my heart about what I believe is true at this time, and I do believe there is a truth. So that's what I'm going to do. I also believe there are many lies out there that are threatening the safety and peace of the world that we're living in, as our previous speakers already said. And one way to counter lies is to speak truth. I am from Norway, and this obviously shapes my worldview. This summer, I got up in front of a group of young people from the Balkans, and I talked about the benefits of paying taxes for the common good. And this is a very strange concept in this part of the world. But I believe in the common good. I believe that what benefits the society as a whole will also benefit me. And all my life, I held this assumption and I took it for granted, and I thought it was shared by everyone. But living in a different culture, in a different country, has taught me that this is not the case. So it is my belief in the common good that, for example, compels me to wait in line rather than push past others to try and get to the cashier first. It's this belief in the common good that tells me to follow the rules in traffic, to make way so that others can pass, to not throw litter on the sidewalk because it's going to be unpleasant for the next person walking by. And this also reminds me, by the way, if you've ever walked into a public bathroom in this part of the world, you will get an encounter very quickly with what most people think about the common good here. But similarly, getting vaccinated against COVID-19 and following some basic rules and protective measures are, to me, just other acts for the common good. And so I'm going to illustrate why I believe this with a little comparison, because there are 2 countries that I'm most familiar with, and that's Norway and Romania, because I live in Romania now, and I'm from Norway. So when I checked the numbers this morning, Norway is close to reaching 80% vaccination of its entire population. And after a brief peak this summer, the infection rates are on their way down. The country reopened fully last Saturday. Most of those who lost their jobs are back at work, and those who didn't lose their jobs are better off financially than ever before. The economy is more active than it was pre-pandemic. Schools are open, people are back to their usual routine. And in Norway, most people, I would argue, believe in the common good. And most people took precautions, respected the protective measures, and they got vaccinated when they had the chance. And the numbers of hospitalizations and deaths in Norway have been low throughout the pandemic. And now, finally, Norway is approaching some kind of post-pandemic new normal, which is what we all want, right? And in contrast to this, Romania has been providing free public access to vaccinations since March this year, but it has only managed to vaccinate 26% of its population from the numbers I saw this morning. And it looked good for a while over the summer. The country had very low infection rates, but almost immediately after the summer holiday ended, the numbers skyrocketed again. And the infection rate in Romania has never been so high. More than 100 people are dying from COVID-19 every single day in this country. We're approaching another lockdown. Businesses will suffer. Schools might close down again. Romania is further away from reaching a post-pandemic new normal than ever before. So the main difference that I see here between Norway and Romania in this scenario is the most obvious, the vaccination rates. And the cause for this difference is the number of people who have bought into anti-vaccine narratives and conspiracy theories about the virus itself. And it can also be seen as a reflection of the general people's trust in authorities and experts and political leaders, which in Norway is very high, in Romania it's very low. There are good reasons for why many people in this country have a large dose of skepticism towards authorities. There's been poor and corrupt leadership, lies, miscommunication, things that Romanians have grown accustomed to through years of communism and after, and in some cases, not trusting authorities has been the right approach. But right now, the consequences are fatal. I want to talk about how my experience was, because when I got the vaccine, I was overjoyed. I thought this is going to be our lifeboat, our ticket through and out of the pandemic. When everyone would get their vaccines, we wouldn't be at risk to each other anymore. No more quarantines, no more lockdowns, no more masks. And as soon as I had the chance, I went to get my vaccine. My husband and I danced in our living room. We celebrated that day. We thought it was the beginning of the end. And a few months later, we realized not everyone wanted the vaccine. In fact, a lot of people were very loudly and proudly against the vaccine. And shockingly, it was more often than not fellow believers, followers of Jesus. And I was surprised at first. And then I was disappointed, then frustrated and enraged, and then sad and depressed. I would have thought it was obvious for any Christian. Getting the vaccine is the most practical way to love your neighbor in a pandemic. It's the only way to get us safely out of the pandemic. And to be honest, I struggle because no matter how carefully I try to put my words together, they will come out in a condescending us versus them language. And if it's one thing we don't need, it's more of that. We who are in favor of the vaccine and other protective measures, we claim to be on the side of science. But those who are against the vaccine and against protective measures also claim to be on the side of science. So those who are against it will claim that they will accuse me of being naive because I listen to public health authorities and experts as they are portrayed in the mass media. And I would accuse them of being paranoid for believing that all of this is just one big thought to take away their freedoms. And the more we argue, the more deeply entrenched we get into our own ideas and opinions as we hold on to their life, to the worldview that we have adopted and integrated into our identity. And I don't really think these types of arguments, honest and well-intentioned as they may be, are getting us anywhere. So in the middle of all this division and hopelessness, I still believe that we as followers of Jesus have a responsibility and the opportunity to be salt and light in the world. And in Jesus, who is the heart of the Christian faith, we have a perfect example to follow, which surpasses our differences. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's the greatest commandment, second only to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And Jesus also said, by this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. How far are we from that today, I wonder? So how do we practice loving our neighbors in this pandemic? So first, as I mentioned, I believe getting vaccinated and using safety measures to avoid spreading the virus is the most practical way to show love to our neighbors. While I am young and healthy and would most likely be perfectly okay, even if I got the virus. We don't know. I might unknowingly pass it on to someone else, someone older, someone less healthy than me. And so for me, the vaccine and the protective measures are more about protecting the other, and in this way, loving the other. And the second thing is that I'm asking, how do I love my neighbor even when I'm convinced that they're acting selfishly and irresponsibly and they're willingly making themselves a threat to the public health, making my own and everyone else's lives miserable for the unforeseeable future? How do I love that photographer that Livia was mentioning at the beginning? I don't have the answer to this, but I expect we would start by remembering that I am loved even when I am irrational, irresponsible, and selfish. And I love them, I choose to love them by trying to put myself in their shoes and doing my very best to understand, respect their concerns, because many have very valid concerns on all sides of this. Empathize with what people are going through, even if I completely disagree with their opinions and their actions. And if they need me, I will still be there for them in whatever way I can, even if that's physically very far away. And that's, I think, if all of us would try and adopt a sacrificial attitude like this and thinking of our neighbors' needs first and our own second, would we still be having these discussions? Would there still be a pandemic left to speak of? I'm just going to leave it at that, Tihomir.
Thank you, Camilla, very much. You have indeed challenged us with a few questions that we need to continue thinking about a lot, especially the last one. If we have been loving each other as we were meant to, would we be at this moment where we are still 2 years into these pandemics? I'm picking also another moment from your presentation, because I'm facing this on a regular basis. Both sides claim to be on the side of science. And obviously, this cannot be true, that both sides are on the side of science, regardless of the claims. And this is now leading me to our next panelist, to Tihomir Odorčić. And I'm really glad that we have a medical doctor here with us today, because I have a question, Tihomir, for you. People caught up in the web of conspiracies are claiming and believing the false statements that those who are vaccinated are dying in large numbers. You have probably heard that. I've heard this repeatedly. Recently, a person told me, I would rather get COVID 6 times than being vaccinated once. My question to you is very simple. What is the truth about vaccinations? Do vaccines save lives? What have you learned through your own encounters with the COVID patients? Tihomir, time is yours, please.
Good evening from Slovenia. Thank you, Tihomir, for inviting me to this webinar. I'm not good in speaking English in such a way, but I've written for me the things I will say to you, and I have used many charts that will speak more than my language here. So why do people hesitate about vaccines or even oppose them is a whole new theme, and believe me, a very complex one. The question about the safety of COVID vaccines is much easier to answer. Yes, I can say COVID vaccines are safe, as vaccines in general are. And let me now show you some of my slides and my charts. Yes, vaccinated people can have reactions immediately after vaccinations. They can have raised body temperatures, some painfulness in the shoulder, and maybe they won't feel well for 1 or 3 days. And those reactions affect only 10 to 15% of the vaccinated. But possible side effects are another story, and they are very rare. They can occur in weeks after vaccination, much less often than in case of other vaccinations known to us from the history of vaccination. As far as we know by now, there is a 0.017% of possible side effects after taking COVID vaccines. It means that there can be 170 cases of some side effects after getting vaccinated of 1 million people. And if you know that there are millions and millions of vaccinated, and that the whole process is constantly under the watchful eye of the public, then these numbers grow in our perception. As far as it concerns my experience with vaccines, I can report not one case of a harmful effect after more than 1,000 of my patients have been vaccinated with Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines. And your second question, do vaccines save lives? The answer is very simple. Yes, they do. And how? I will show you on next slides. Right now, we are in the middle of the third wave of COVID-19 pandemic, which is driven by the most infectious variant of SARS-CoV-2 virus, the infamous Delta. Vaccination is going on, not so fast as we would wish to go, because only 2.2% of people in low-income countries have received at least one dose. And as you can see on this world map, which was updated last Sunday, it is really so. We see the whole African continent is nearly white here on this map. And some of wealthy countries are very dark green. On this map of Europe, we can see the typical dividing map between East and West. We have heard the speaker before me who told us about Romania. I see here a big area of 29% vaccinated in Russia. Russia, although has invented its own COVID vaccine, you know, it's Sputnik 5 or V, I don't know which is the right pronunciation. Is it Sputnik V or 5? And has released it very early in the pandemic, earlier than any Western country. Their share of vaccinated population is really small, as you can see. And this dividing between West and East is also seen on the next two maps. If we compare these two maps of Europe, we can see that the percentage of the fully vaccinated is inversely proportional to the weekly increment of cases throughout the continent, with the exception of the UK, where they have dismissed all previous precaution measures. You see more greenish on the right map. It means slower increment or decrement. They are having every week less cases. I speak about the right map of Europe. And on the left map, more green, more means more vaccinated people from the total population of a country. As you see, Spain and Portugal are leading in Europe, and Belgium also. The following charts will show us how more extensive vaccination can decrease the number of deaths. Red bars represent the numbers of cases per week. White bars represent the numbers of deaths because of COVID per week. And green bars stand for administered doses of vaccines per week. Here on this slide, we have the comparison between US and UK. More vaccinated means less deaths. The difference is obvious. As you can see on the On the right side, in the United Kingdom, we have many cases in the last weeks, in the last months, but the increase of deaths per week is very slow and very low. On the next map, we see, although the difference of fully vaccinated between Croatia and Slovenia isn't very big, we can clearly spot the difference between the number of deaths in last weeks. Same can be told for the comparison between Serbia and Slovenia. On the next slide, the situation of this week is getting only worse, but we don't have it yet on our charts. Bosnia and Herzegovina is a sad story in many ways. Only 13% are fully vaccinated in this country. More than 3,000 deaths per 1 million of population because of COVID. And the difference of those white bars following the red ones is more than obvious. In last 28 days, Bosnia had less cases than Slovenia, but nearly 8 times more deaths. Yes, it can also mean that they in Bosnia don't test so extensively as in Slovenia, but again, it can be so much less. A very similar picture with North Macedonia. And what was the question from the beginning? Do vaccines save lives? Answer it for yourselves. Romania, we already heard something about Romania, is a member of EU, but for an inexplicable reason, they don't follow the vaccination practice of EU. Romania has just 4 times more cases than Slovenia, but 20 times more deaths. And there is one thing more to say. All these Eastern countries, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, North Macedonia, etc., don't have an evenly spread pattern of vaccination through their countries. Bigger cities are more vaccinated, the countryside much more less. Bulgaria is following the same pattern as we saw on the slide before. And let us now compare the best vaccinated country in Europe with, for example, Slovenia. After going through a tragedy in the second wave of the pandemic, Portugal is now a champion of COVID vaccination in Europe and in the world. 85% of the total population of Portugal is fully vaccinated. They seem to be already out of the third wave. See the ongoing lowering of both the red and the white bars. Australia is a story for itself. It is one of the countries with lowest number of deaths per million people, only 43 deaths per million people. They achieved it with very strict lockdown regulations, and allow me to use the word with repressive methods. The results are very small amount of COVID deaths, but also a very late start of vaccination. Only 2 weeks ago, they were at only 30% of fully vaccinated. Such a low rate of vaccinated has put them in jeopardy during the third wave. So they understood the seriousness of the situation, and by the end of the last week, they got to the point of 42%. So in 2 weeks, they increased their percentage by 12%. My opinion is that when they once reach the 60+%, they can count with loosening all of these draconian measures, which, by the way, have rescued them from all possible black scenarios. Just think of some European countries, what they have gone through, and all Australian terror will be justified. And the last slide displays my own statistics. This is the last 100 positive PCR tests in my COVID clinic. 75 were unvaccinated. were unvaccinated. So this is my contribution to this webinar. Thank you very much.
Tihomir, thank you very much, very much. It's an eye-opening, I would say, for everyone who wants to see. And the answer is very simple. Yes, vaccines definitely are saving lives. We can debate and we can argue about the measures, whether they are too much or too little in different countries. But the fact is that in those countries, and I think, and Jill would definitely agree with this, when we look at the map of America, that those states that have been actually following the restrictions and the rules and regulations more seriously have less problem with COVID than those states who, for whichever reasons, ideological and other reasons, have been really arrogant about it. But I would like to link this now to you, Heather, because even despite of the maps and the other things, there will still be many people who would continue being confused, and they would say, yes, but what about this? What about this? What about this? And what about this? And many of those people are sincere. They're just deceived, let's say it very clearly. I have a question for you, since you, Heather, are in the political streams and you are facing the same challenge from a different angle. How to pursue legitimate questions and conversations about COVID-19 pandemics and vaccination in the climate of aggressive refusal to engage in public action for a common good? How do we join those two things? Have a good conversation, motivate the people, yet the reality is refusal in all kinds of ways. Please, Heather, you're welcome.
Thanks, Tihomir. And I also want to thank the other Tihomir as well. That was one of the clearest, I think, presentations of statistics and graphs I've seen in a long time. That includes our prime ministerial briefings. So thank you very much for that. And also thank you for bringing up the Global South, which I think gets forgotten quite a lot. And I will mention slightly in this talk as well. I must apologize, as I will probably, like Camilla, actually be asking more questions than answering. As even to answer these questions depends on one starting point at times. What do we mean by legitimate or who's common good? And I'm quite glad that some of that has been answered as we've gone through this topic today. And the starting point for all conversation, I have to say, must be to listen, to engage and to treat one another with dignity and value. Of course, there is a line, especially if that discourse runs into hate speech or things are actually dangerous because of misinformation that also hinder public health policy or the public good, as it were. It certainly makes life a lot more difficult when you are fighting constant misinformation. There is a reason that we have an agreed set of common law and decisions made by experts, because left on our own, society just will not function. Those rules can protect and they can also harm. However, when the area is new or their trust has been eroded, that's when life gets incredibly difficult. A friend actually said to me, if people have genuine scientifically based concern, they may argue that the common good is upheld by a precautionary principle with regards to medical procedure. In fact, to continue without caution would for them actually be going against the common good. So it can be complex and at times maybe a non-binary situation. But that is perhaps really different from those who would make it all about some kind of global conspiracy. There is a wider point. We're experiencing a post-Enlightenment phase where people's faith in rationalism has been shaken. Science does not, after all, seem to have all the answers all the time. And experts may at times actually get things wrong as they try to figure out new strategies. So one day you may be briefing on one thing and the next day it might change slightly as more evidence comes to light. That can put doubt sometimes in people's minds. In this, of course, there are always those who will seek to profit from the spiritual vacuum this creates, including forms of sort of counter argument as well, by so-called experts, or maybe those YouTube videos we watch, or Facebook experts, who undermine generally held consensus views because it increases their profit profile and also their profit margin. Or it's done for political gain or instability in society, as we've heard about. No stability means confidence in the system is replaced by fear, leading to social instability. and community is replaced by individualism. Social welfare and concern is replaced by maybe even market economics, and that's another discussion. But it can also undermine a global effort where people are trying to do the right thing, and as we've alluded to, the global south, making sure that vaccine patents are shared and vaccines reach the global south instead of stockpiling vaccine in wealthy nations. This can happen not just by individualism on a governmental or corporate level, but also by suspicion of vaccination programs in general, by populations in need of treatment, and that can be also cultural as well. And it's about combating that. How do we do this? Because it's a global pandemic, which means a global response, but also about legitimate question. Well, I learned a lesson on listening a while ago. I got thoroughly chastised. I was talking to a friend about vaccines, and there was a little culture and personality clash. One where they wanted info on vaccines and wanted to talk through side effects or say what others were saying. I was hearing, however, I don't want the vaccine, and I went into full, I shall prove to you why vaccines are fine and why through history we've used them, even though neither of us are medically trained nor scientists. And our friendly conversation suddenly became an argument and then extremely heated. I wasn't hearing my friends, I'm afraid, I just need a voice to listen. I was acting out of fear as well, and I had to apologize to them because in my mind, my friend had bought into conspiracy, or I was terrified that they would actually not be safe and would also get really sick. I resorted to rationalism rather than humanity. My friend did get the vaccine, but in that moment, what she needed to hear from me was a listening ear. One, I'm saying, I recognize you're scared, but how can I help and how can we do this together? As has been said, there is a legitimate question, and I personally would hope that everyone who is able can get a vaccine to protect themselves and others, and to take the strain off our brilliant health services. The Whittington Hospital, where I had my surgery last week on an ankle operation, actually spent most of its entire budget was being spent on COVID. That's how serious this situation is. Choice comes with and carries responsibility that also affects one another. And there have been several disturbing cases here in the UK of groups sending literature to people comparing lockdowns or vaccines to the Holocaust, which is highly inappropriate. Also cases of picketing hospitals, graffiti showing swastikas on hospital walls, harassment of doctors and nurses trying to save people's lives, or the deliberate harassment of parents and teachers at schools. This isn't choice or legitimate question in my view. That's self-promotion and extremely dangerous action that puts people's lives at risk. People should be treated with dignity, and that extends to not screaming at a doctor or parent's face. And those that do those things make life harder for the people who have genuine questions to be able to ask them, because they get pushed into another world where they can't express those questions or those fears. This has been a situation that is new in some cases. The approval for drugs and discovery made at a fantastic speed, and that should be something to be celebrated in my view. However, I understand people may have questions and concerns. What's in it? What does it do? What if I'm allergic? What about if I'm pregnant, etc.? I want to use an analogy here. So last week, as I alluded to, I had an ankle surgery. I was asked to consent and given a huge list of all the things that could potentially go wrong. I was then told the percentage for success and the percentage for the thing coming back in the first place. I was able to sit down with my surgeon and ask him questions. And I also wanted to ask about the general anaesthetic. Now, I just actually signed the form because I wanted it over and done with. Just do the thing, get it done. I also trusted the consultant, but I was still putting, in effect, my life in his hands because I had no idea how my body would react. It's something they do all the time. It's something we do all the time. And I'm pleased to report, as you can see, I am still here. Now, my aftercare also had more forms, and also this drug you need to take, and this drug you need to take, and this has 100 side effects for this painkiller. But I just said, you know what? Give me the drugs, it's going to help me. I'm also double jabbed. And again, when I went for my vaccine, I asked a question. I was given a list of side effects, but I did still take it, as I have done all my travel vaccines and all my childhood ones. Someone who didn't want a vaccine said to my gran recently, well, I don't have polio. And my gran said to them, yeah, because you were vaccinated when you were little. I expect, as with all medical advances, there have always been questions, concern, and sadly, conspiracy. One of the moments recently in the UK that has been a clear line crossing debates relates to a really disturbing and horrific crime. A police officer was found to have arrested a woman on false pretense of COVID restrictions. He then kidnapped and murdered her. In court today, this evil man was sentenced to a life term in prison. At the trial, a group of anti-lockdown protesters staged a very inappropriate rally outside the courthouse to make a political statement. Now, it was horrifically apparent COVID had been used to make this false arrest. However, this type of abuse of power has occurred in many terrible situations well before COVID regulations were brought in the UK, especially to people of colour. Any person in a position of power has the choice to abuse or not abuse their position, and that was evil. The COVID regs didn't kill her, an evil, sadistic person did. And this has sadly been the case on far too many occasions. And we see examples of abuse of power in many countries around the world, in many types of professions. To use that situation was wrong and absolutely not in the public good. The case highlighted the need for accountability and then transparency for corruption to be rooted out. Just want to come into a close, but what I did want to highlight was a recent BBC article on conspiracy. And it said that conspiracy needs the right villain. Each society has its own anxieties and obsessions, and successful conspiracy traps into this and also acknowledges the knowledge gap people have. People may turn to the internet to fill their minds with things they don't understand or cannot control. It can lead to a kind of rabbit hole. There's also a book that says a lot of people are saying, and I love that phrase, a lot of people are saying, because we hear it all the time. A lot of people said this and that and this. It says there's been an increase in conspiracy without theory, but I'd go further and say there's been an increase of conspiracy of convenience. It can also be helpful to run to conspiracy because then I can avoid doing something I might have to admit I'm maybe a bit scared of, or maybe I can get out of doing something altogether. It's convenient. And I want to end with this quote. It's by a poet called Lawrence Overmere, and he simply said, "Doing the right thing, surrendering our short-term self-interest to serve the needs of the whole has never been easy for humankind. But now more than ever, that is exactly what we must do. Future generations are counting on us." Thanks, Tihomir.
Thank you, Heather. I'm very much aware of the time, but we do want to hear also Dr. Zdravko Plantak. Our main focus with this webinar are people who are Christians, who are believers, who are followers of Jesus, and yet we are living in an environment which is so much polarized. So I would like to finish, Zdravko, with a question which brings us back to Christian community and giving some answers to the Christian community that's confused about the current situation. Unfortunately, too many Christians are the leaders in spreading or believing all kinds of conspiracies related to vaccines, wearing masks, and following other measures meant to protect us and take us out of the pandemics. For example, just yesterday, I received a message from an unknown person aware of our webinars with a question that speaks volumes. Are you born again Christian? So I have a question for you, Zdravko. Do Christians who are objecting to vaccination and other measures have a legitimate biblical justification for their actions and decisions? Please, Zdravko.
Thank you. It's always incredible pleasure to be part of this group because I learn continually, and I just take very seriously 6 or 7 previous thoughts and speakers, because you have immeasurably enriched me in your thinking, and also in some way what I was thinking and preparing you've already said. So maybe there will be some repetition. I might add one Calvin's perspective at the end of my few minutes. So we are living in not only the viral pandemic, but info pandemic. And as a recent article that I read titled suggested, freedom to harm is not freedom, it is license and it's immoral. You see, there is no biblical text that says be vaccinated. There is no biblical text that says do not be vaccinated. But at the end of the day, there is no biblical text that says, put a seatbelt on when you drive a car or a helmet on your head when you drive a motorbike. And yet we as Christians do tend to go and try to find ways how to make decisions on the basis of an understanding of the gospel message and of the biblical principles. As I said, and several of you have mentioned that it's obviously wonderful to live in a free society. However, even in modern Western societies, there are limits to personal freedoms. And there are certainly limits to our freedoms if we claim to be followers of Jesus. Another article that I was contemplating on in the last few days from Lackey, who said, as a Christian, this is what I believe, he said, and I resonate, what my freedom is. Galatians 5:13, for you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. That is the kind of Christian freedom, the Christian principle. So while there are no vaccine mandates or non-mandates in terms of biblical text directly, there are principles that inform me as a Christ follower on how I make decisions. 1 Peter 2:16, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. And of course, as it was mentioned many times, love your God and love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commands depends all the law and the prophets. So if the issue of COVID-19 or the measures we learned and had to relearn over the last 18 months that can mitigate the pandemic's assault on human life and on human health, immediate as well as long-term, increasing hygiene, distancing, mask wearing, and yes, successful vaccination was only affecting me personally, my freedom and my choice would be purely then personal. But my choice is always in these kind of circumstances communal, because we are not talking about my illness, but a pandemic, epidemic that became worldwide pandemic. And therefore it is social in terms of how I need to view those decisions. It affects those more vulnerable or those that for various medical reasons or children, so people around me are not maybe able to take vaccines. It is not only my personal freedom, it is social responsibility, and also it is my faith responsibility. And that is something that has been very much on my mind as I, again, read people like Albert Mohler, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, who suggested that people who approach vaccination as a personal choice with consequences that affect only them should think more broadly about their susceptible neighbors. There are third parties, people who cannot take the vaccines or do not have yet access, that we need to think about. And this is the kind of general principle that also my own president of the Loma Linda University, who is a practicing physician, and still, despite the fact that he's a president of the gigantic University of Health Sciences, is every Thursday practicing in the clinic. His medical license is also a doctor of public health, wrote in a recent article this: those of us who have had the privilege of watching human nature for many years remember similar battles around compulsory use of seatbelts, motorcycle helmets, fluoridation of water supplies, and various other public health mandates. Perhaps the most pertinent example is smoking. As long as your smoking was just a danger to you, we were willing to let you pursue your habit. But when research showed that secondhand smoke from you is damaging my health, the tide turned and smoke bans were instituted in public places, even in places that we couldn't believe, like pubs in United Kingdom. That seems to be, he didn't say that, I added that. That seems to be the crux of the controversy today. If someone wants to risk their lives, and even their health, for not being vaccinated, that is their right. But when their decision puts others at risk, It assumes a broader public health impact for all of us, and also a Christian responsibility. And so my last point is this, as I said about Calvin. It is through the creational theology that has not been mentioned. A lot of texts have been mentioned, and I repeated some, maybe some new I added, but here's additional component to this. Creational theology, from Augustine in the West to Gregory of Nyssa in the East, from early Christians through the Reformation and into the Enlightenment. Many Christians share this theology. Drawing upon Scripture, creational theology rejoices in the manifold works, including the reasonable, mental capacity to think. And that is why many of our institutions, church institutions, are involved with healthcare sciences and with hospitals. Many hospitals are owned by Christian faith traditions, Catholic, Protestant, in my case, Adventist, and others. And it is amazing how this level of thinking through the scientific discovery has been developed over the last year and a half in terms of the COVID. It has started in many, many decades ago, but it has increased tenfold. So for example, the research that was being published, publishing 1,000 papers a year, has last year published 12,000 papers on those issues, all across the board of politics or the national boundaries, for the world scientists to continue working from different walks of life on those issues. And we have received from them an amazing gift that I would call truly a miracle. So let me conclude with this point. Calvin applied his theology of creation and sees that medicine as the knowledge of carefully using the gifts of creation is in fact a divine gift. Would Calvin assume that these medicines are devoid of risk? Absolutely not. Imagine what he might say about the extensive safety testing for treatments like COVID-19 vaccine. But even without large-scale testing, Calvin insisted that through medicine, God, I quote, provides us with the capacity to attend to our illnesses. Indeed, he exclaims, whoever does not take account of the means or medicine which God has ordained does not have confidence in God, but is puffed up with false pride and temerity. So I shall end at that. I think that we've heard from Luther, we've heard from a variety of different church groups, and most of the church institutions have said they are not against vaccination, and the Bible does not have a mandate against vaccination. Here are the reasons: creational theology, loving of our neighbor, and using our freedoms not to be puffed up and self-serving, but using our freedoms in order to have responsibility for those who are around us, who are vulnerable, and who are in a community that we as Christians are called to love. Thank you.
Thank you, Zdravko. Well, we have received today so much. And that's one of the reasons why we are going to place this also on YouTube and also leave it on Facebook, because I'm sure that even you who have been watching this webinar live would like to go back and to hear again what you heard just today. I would ask for your allowance only for a few more minutes, because I have one more question for all of you, and I would really like you to be brief. I understand that I think at least one of our panelists had to leave because of work obligations, but those of you who are here, in the orders you have spoken, I have one question for you, because I would like us somehow to offer something promising as much as we can, although this is a very delicate matter. As followers of Jesus, what are we to be in the midst of the current crisis filled with misinformation, lies, disregard for truth, lack of empathy, and increasingly abusive manifestations of hate? So could you quickly think, and within a minute or two, each one of you just try to think aloud, try to share your thoughts with us. And then after that, we are going to close this webinar. So where do we begin? Maybe leave you if you have a thought, and then the rest of you.
I think we have to just be simply and more intense than ever. If you're a poet, be a poet. If you're a doctor, be a doctor. If you're a jerk, try and change yourself. I think we've been inside the last year for too long. We tried to get out. We're still under this oppression we forgot to be. So let's just be fully, intensely. And let's do our little bit, our jobs the right way.
Thank you, Livio. I think Jill had to leave. So Arnold, would you have a thought or two?
Basically, would like to say thank you guys, and hopefully that we all can begin to move forward as we deal with misinformation, and everyone will begin to believe the report that COVID is real. It's life devastating, but it can change if we all do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnold. And then Camilla, please.
I agree. I think we need to be part of the solution. Exactly how we do that, I don't know, but maybe we can start by listening. I'm not saying that I think everyone is right in this case. I think there is, like I said, I think there is a truth, and I think there are many lies. But that doesn't mean we cannot listen to each other as brothers and sisters, as friends and family. I believe we can listen with courage and humility and empathy, and maybe we can talk about this in a way that doesn't polarize us even further, but maybe can help us understand. And maybe some of that fear that people have that comes from all this misinformation and lies, maybe some of that fear can go away if we really listen and we have the right approach.
Thank you, Camilla. And now, Tihomir, do you have a thought or two at the end?
Yeah, I would say that it is like with vaccines, we should be those ones who will break the chain of infection. Vaccinated people, more they are breaking this chain of infection. And also in this manner of communicating with one another, our communication should stop to be toxic and too much convincing. We should live with others like friends, and as much as it is possible to talk about other things. If I have a friend who is a big anti-vaxxer, what can I do? I can speak with him about the game today, which was played in soccer or something else, and leave the things that we don't agree by side. So I can't say any more in this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tihomir. Heather, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would simply say, I think we mentioned it already, to be salt and light, and to work out what does that mean? What does it mean for me to be light in the situation to my neighbor? What does it mean to be light or to be the good salt? And I think, exactly what Tihomir and Camilla have said before, but how do I do that in this situation? How do I be that kind of better person? How do I bring clarity to perhaps a very confused moment? Or how do I lower a tone of a debate where it's getting a little heated? How do I keep the focus, and how do I keep Christ at the center of everything I'm doing in this moment? So I think that's where I'd start from, is recognizing what's going on in our own heart, what's going on in other people around us, and what does that practically look like for me right now in any given situation. And
thank you, Heather. And I know, Zdravko, you spoke a moment ago, but maybe you have a sentence or two to share before we close it completely.
Yeah, just to end, I had a friend who was doing PhD at Oxford University while I was still doing my master's thesis, and he told me about kenosis and kenotic theory, and I got so excited about Philippians 2 and learning about Jesus and his kenosis. And Now, I think that applies so much to us, because the kenotic theory of Jesus starts this way: do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of the others. I think that's what we could do. And as we do it, even in this webinar and in other ways, we need to do it in humility and in love.
Thank you. And on those thoughts, we are going to now bring to conclusion our webinar that we have planned for you for today. And I would just like to say thank you, all of you who have joined us live on Zoom, and for patiently being with us and listening to the very end. And thank you, panelists. Thank you, Liviu, Jill, Arnold, Camilla, Tihomir, Heather, and Zdravko, for your participation. You have really brought a true content and the quality. Each one of you brought something precious to this webinar today. Friends, I would like to encourage you to, this is going to be on Facebook, this is going to be on YouTube. If you believe and think that something good was said today, spread the good word, say to others, point to this webinar or let them watch this, because lots of things that need to be heard today and watched today were covered today in our webinar. Again, thank you very much. Follow us, and we will be in a few weeks, most likely continuing with our conversation. Thank you again, and may God bless us and you all.